The girl had never spoken to a stranger before. That was what her grandmother would say later, to anyone who would listen. That Rosie had never, not once in her 6 years, reached for someone she didn't know. But she reached for Owen Calloway that morning. Wait. Owen Calloway was on the list. Start over. The girl had never spoken to a stranger before. That was what her grandmother would say later, that Piper had never once, in her 6 years, reached for someone she didn't know. But she reached for him that Tuesday morning in the east wing of Sunridge Medical Center, her small fingers closing around the sleeve of his work jacket like she'd done it 100 times before, and she said, very quietly, so only he could hear, "You smell like my dad, the real one." His name was Declan Morrow. He was 41 years old, and he had driven 40 minutes from Stittsville to Canada that morning, because the heating system on the 3rd floor of Sunridge had been throwing error codes since before the weekend, and the hospital's facilities manager had finally called someone who knew what they were doing. That was how the dispatch sheet described it. Someone who knows what they're doing. Declan had read that and almost smiled. He had a bag over one shoulder and a diagnostic unit in his left hand when the girl grabbed his sleeve. He was moving through the corridor that connected the children's ward to the elevator bank, walking the way he always walked, head slightly down, taking in the space, noting the ceiling vents and the placement of the return air grills out of habit. He nearly didn't see her at all. She was sitting on one of the padded benches along the corridor wall, wearing a hospital gown and a pair of socks with small foxes on them. And she was alone. Not the kind of alone that suggested she'd been left there on purpose. The kind of alone that meant someone had stepped away for just a moment and hadn't come back yet. She was small, and her hair was loose, and she looked at Declan with the particular calm of a child who has recently been very frightened and has decided to be brave instead. "Hey," he said, stopping. "You okay there?" She nodded but didn't let go of his sleeve. "You looking for somebody?" "No," she said. "Then, you smell like my dad, the real one." Declan didn't know what to say to that. He stood very still, the way he did when a machine gave him a reading he hadn't expected, not alarmed, just paying attention. He looked down at her. She looked back up at him. She had dark eyes and a small band-aid on her left forearm over what looked like an IV site. "My name's Declan," he said finally. "I'm Piper," she said. "Are you a patient here, Piper?" "I was," she said, with a gravity that was slightly too large for her face. "They said I can go home today. My mom is getting the paperwork." "Ah," he said. "So she'll be right back." Yes, she still had his sleeve. "Are you a doctor?" "No, I fix things." She considered this. "What kind of things?" "Heating, ventilation, the systems that make buildings breathe." He paused. "Like right now, there's a unit on the 3rd floor that's been running too hard and making everything too cold up there. I'm going to fix it." "That's why the nurses wear sweaters," Piper said, like she'd solved something. "Probably. Yeah." She finally released his sleeve, but she didn't look away. "My dad used to come home smelling like that. Like metal and something warm. He worked on engines." Declan says diagnostic bag down on the bench beside her, not too close. "What kind?" "Aircraft," she said, and the word came out careful, practiced, the way children say things they've heard many times. He was an aircraft maintenance engineer. He worked at the Ottawa airport. She looked at her fox socks. "He died when I was 4. There it was. Declan had felt it coming the way you feel a shift in pressure before weather rolls in. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it the way you mean things, when you've also lost someone, and you understand that the words are not enough, but they're what you have. "It was a car accident," she said, matter-of-factly, the way children sometimes report enormous things because they haven't yet learned that they should soften them. "He wasn't even at work. He was coming home." Declan nodded slowly. He thought about his own daughter, Ruthie, 8 years old, who was in school right now in Stittsville, who had eaten toast for breakfast and complained that her backpack zipper was sticking, who had no idea that every morning, when she walked through the school doors, her father stood at the car window and watched until she was safely inside. He thought about all the mornings he had come home from a job smelling like grease and metal and warm circuitry, and Ruthie had buried her face in his jacket the way she always did, not even conscious of it, just needing the smell of him. "He sounds like he was good at his job," Declan said. "The best," Piper said without hesitation. Then she looked up. "You should probably go fix the heater." He almost laughed. "You're right. I should, but will you come back? After?" Declan looked at her, this small, serious girl with fox socks and a Band-Aid and more composure than most adults he knew. "Sure," he said, "if you're still here." She nodded. Like this was a reasonable arrangement. He picked up his bag and walked toward the elevator, and he didn't look back, but he felt her watching him until he turned the corner. The third-floor unit was worse than the dispatch notes had suggested. It wasn't just throwing error codes. The secondary exchanger had a partial blockage, and someone had, at some point in the last 6 months, adjusted a bypass valve in a way that suggested they had been trying to fix the problem themselves, and had instead created 2 new ones. Declan crouched in the mechanical room for 20 minutes before he even touched anything, just tracing the system, reading it the way he read every system, the way his father had taught him to. Understand it first, then fix it. His father had been a mechanic. His grandfather, too. Declan had grown up in a house in Nepean where the garage was warmer than the kitchen in winter, and you learned to read a manual before you learned to drive. He had taken his apprenticeship at 19 and his engineer's certification at 26, and had spent the next 15 years building a reputation that he was quietly, stubbornly proud of. Not because anyone told him to be proud of it, but because he had built it himself, with his hands, and it had never once let him down. The work was real. It stayed fixed. That mattered. He was replacing the bypass valve assembly when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the mechanical room. Sharp, quick, the kind that belonged to someone who moved through spaces like they owned them. And then the door opened and a woman stood in the frame. She was dressed for a boardroom, not a hospital. Dark blazer, dark trousers, low heels. Her hair was up. She was holding a phone in one hand and a manila folder in the other, and she looked at Declan with the particular expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and found it not quite as they expected. "I was told the facilities technician was up here," she said. "That's me." He didn't stand up. He was in the middle of something. "I'll be done in about 20 minutes. She looked at the open panel, the removed valve, the tools arranged on the cloth he'd laid down. "What exactly is the problem?" "Blocked exchanger and a bypassed return valve. Someone tried to fix it manually and created a pressure imbalance. I've got the new assembly in now. Just need to run the diagnostic before I close it up." A pause. "The last technician said it was a software issue." "It's not a software issue. He was with a certified HVAC firm." Declan looked up at her for the first time. "Then they sent you someone who didn't look past the error code." He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to the valve. "This will hold. The other fix wouldn't have." She stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then, with the air of someone who is reassessing something but not yet ready to admit it, she said, "I'm Margot Alderton." He had heard the name. Most people in his line of work had heard it, in the way that certain names circulate in certain cities. Margot Alderton had built a medical technology company called Alderton Neurosystems from a founding team of 4 people working out of a leased space in Canada to a company with over 300 employees and a contract with 3 provincial health authorities. She sat on the board of the Ottawa Hospital. She was, according to the business section of The Citizen, one of the more formidable people in the city. "Declan Morrow," he said. "This is your company? It's my name on the license." "Yeah." Another pause. "Do you need anything from me to finish?" "Access to the rooftop air handler before I leave. I want to check the intake. I'll have someone meet you up there." She looked at him for another moment, not unkindly, but with the flat, assessing quality of someone who categorizes people quickly and files them away, and then she left, her footsteps already fading down the corridor. Declan went back to the valve. He found Piper still in the corridor when he came back down through the east wing. She was sitting in the same spot, but now a woman was with her, crouching at her level, speaking to her in a low voice. And Declan recognized the blazer and the posture before he recognized the face. Margot Alderton was Piper's mother. He almost kept walking. It would have been the simpler thing. He had signed the work order, cleared the access log. He could be out of the building in 4 minutes. But Piper looked up at that exact moment and her face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like the particular relief of a child who has been waiting and was beginning to wonder if waiting was worth it. "You came back," she said. Margot stood up. She looked at Declan and then at Piper and then back at Declan, with the expression of someone revising a situation. "You know my daughter?" she said. "We talked for a minute this morning," Declan said. "On my way up, in the corridor," Piper said helpfully. "He fixes the heaters." Margot's expression settled into something careful. "Piper, you talked to a stranger?" "He's not a stranger now," Piper said with ironclad logic. "Piper, he smells like Dad." She said it simply, without drama, the way she'd said it the first time. Just a fact that needed to be in the room. Margot went very still. Declan looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "She was fine," he said quietly. "She was waiting for you. We just talked." "About what?" Margot's voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "She told me about her dad, that he was an aircraft engineer." He paused. "She said he was the best." Margot looked at her daughter. Something moved across her face that she controlled before it became visible, almost controlled. There was a long moment of silence in the corridor. "We should get going," Margot said finally to Piper. "The car's downstairs." Piper nodded. She stood up from the bench and came to stand beside her mother, and she took her mother's hand. But before she went, she looked up at Declan. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back." "Of course," he said. He watched them walk down the corridor. Margot's quick, purposeful stride slowed to match Piper's smaller steps, the two of them moving together toward the elevator. At the corner, Piper looked back. She didn't wave, just looked, the way children do when they're memorizing something. Then the elevator doors opened and they were gone. Declan was in the parking lot, loading his tools into the back of his truck when he heard the footsteps behind him. "Mr. Morrow." He turned. Margot Alderton was standing at the edge of the parking lot, still holding her folder. Piper was not with her. A woman who was almost certainly a nanny or an assistant was standing with a small girl by the entrance doors, far enough away to be out of earshot. Declan waited. "I owe you an apology," Margot said. He hadn't been expecting that. "For what?" "For my manner earlier, upstairs." She looked at him steadily. "I can be abrupt. I've been told this." A pause. I've had a long few days. Piper had a respiratory infection. Watching your child in a hospital bed, even for something minor, does things to your reasoning. You don't have to explain yourself," he said. "I know I don't." She glanced toward the entrance, where Piper was now apparently explaining something at length to the woman beside her, with considerable hand gestures. "She doesn't do that. Reach for strangers. She told me that, did she?" It wasn't quite a question. Margot seemed to be working something out. "Her father, my husband, Patrick. He worked maintenance on the regional fleet out of Ottawa. We lost him 3 years ago." She said it the way someone says a thing they have said many times, not without feeling, but with the feeling arranged, organized, carried in a way that lets them keep walking. He did smell like that. Metal and something warm, she's right. Declan said nothing. He just let that sit between them. "She doesn't talk about him to people she doesn't know," Margot said. "She talks about him to me and to her grandmother. That's all. She seems like a kid who knows her own mind," he said. "She's exactly like her father." For a moment, Margot Alderton looked like someone other than the woman in the boardroom blazer. Just for a moment. Then she straightened slightly. "I wanted to say what you said up there. About the valve. You were right. I had 3 different firms look at that unit over the past 4 months, and they all gave me different answers. You were there 40 minutes and you found it. It's not complicated when you know what you're looking at," he said. "No," she said. I suppose it isn't. She paused. Are you local? Stittsville, your work order said. Born there, still there, single operator, license, bonded 15 years. He said it without defensiveness, just the facts. I do a lot of institutional work, schools, clinics, the occasional hospital. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took a business card from her folder. She had been carrying it like she'd already decided before she came down, and held it out. Alderton Neurosystems has 3 facilities in the region. Our current HVAC contractor has, as of this morning, officially failed 3 service reviews. She paused. If you're interested in a conversation, call that number. He took the card. He looked at it. He looked back at her. I'll think about it, he said. She nodded, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She let out a very small, very tired exhale that had nothing professional in it at all. She's been asking to go back to the playground on Hartwell, she said, almost to herself. Patrick used to take her there. I keep finding reasons not to. Declan turned the card over in his hand. Reasons aren't usually the problem, he said quietly. Margot looked at him. I lost my wife 4 years ago, he said. I have a daughter, 8 now, and there were parks I couldn't take her to for a long time because they were somewhere we used to go, all 3 of us. He paused. You go eventually, and it's hard, and then you're glad you went. The parking lot was quiet. Somewhere on the street beyond the lot, a bus went past. I'm sorry, Margot said. About your wife. I'm sorry about your husband. She nodded. She looked toward Piper, who had apparently convinced her minder to look at something in the sky and was now pointing with both hands. Then she looked back at Declan. Thank you, she said, for stopping, for coming back, just for talking to her. She talked to me, he said. I just didn't walk away. He thought about it on the drive back to Stittsville. The card sat on the passenger seat. He didn't touch it again, but he knew it was there. He thought about Piper on the bench, holding his sleeve. He thought about how she'd said the real one. Not to wound anyone, just to make a distinction that mattered to her. Kids were like that. Ruthie was like that. She said exactly what she meant because she hadn't yet learned that the world sometimes preferred you didn't. He picked Ruthie up from school at 3:30. She came out the door mid-sentence, talking to a friend, finished the sentence, and then detached herself and walked toward the truck with the particular focused energy of a child who had been inside all day and needed to be in motion. How was it? He asked when she climbed in. Mrs. Okafor let us do the science unit early, she said with the reverence due to a significant event. We made circuits. I made mine light up on the first try. She looked at him sideways. Not everyone did. Good job, he said. What did you fix today? This was their routine, had been for years. He told her about the job. She listened with the focused, technical attention she'd had since she was 3. Sometimes she asked questions. He told her about the heating unit, the blocked exchanger, the valve that someone had adjusted wrong. She asked 3 clarifying questions, and he answered all of them honestly, including the one about why someone would adjust a bypass valve without understanding the pressure consequences. To which his honest answer was that people sometimes tried to solve problems before they fully understood them, and it usually made things worse. You should understand it first, she said with great certainty. Then fix it. That's exactly right, he said. He didn't tell her about Piper. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because some things needed to settle before they were spoken aloud. Maybe because the particular feeling of a small hand closing around his sleeve, the specific, unreasonable ache of it, was still too present, and he needed to carry it quietly for a little while longer before he could hold it at a distance and look at it. He thought about Patrick, who had worked on aircraft and smelled like metal and warmth, and had died on an ordinary drive home. He thought about how his daughter still reached for that smell in strangers, 6 years old, 2 years after his death, still trying to locate him in the world. He thought about what it meant to leave that behind. The smell of you, the particular way you laughed, or lifted your coffee cup, or crouched down to look at something on the ground, how your children carried it. He reached over and turned the heat up a little. Ruthie had her face turned to the window, watching the fields outside Stittsville go by, the flat gray and brown October sprawl of them. "Dad," she said. Your jacket smells like work." "I know. Sorry." "No," she said, and she said it like he'd missed the point entirely. "I like it. It smells like you fixing something." He kept his eyes on the road. He called the number on the card the following week, on a Thursday morning, standing in his kitchen with his second coffee. He had thought about it for 5 days. He had looked Alderton Neurosystems up, read the public filings, checked the business registry, asked 2 people he trusted whether Margos Alderton was worth the conversation. Both of them independently said, "Absolutely, but she's not easy." He wasn't looking for easy. The woman who answered transferred him to an assistant named Gerald, who asked him 3 questions, and then said that Miss Alderton had a slot at 8:30 the following Tuesday if he was available. He was. He arrived at the Alderton Neurosystems building on Innovation Drive 7 minutes early, which was where he always aimed. Not eager, not late. The building was newer than he'd expected, clean lines, a lot of glass, the kind of architecture that said we take the work seriously. He liked that. The assistant met him in the lobby and walked him to a boardroom on the 2nd floor, and Margos Alderton came in 3 minutes later, still moving at that pace that suggested she was always between 2 things that both mattered. But today there was something slightly different in her bearing. Less armor, maybe, or the same armor, worn differently. "Mr. Morrow," she said. "Thank you for coming, Declan," he said. "Thanks for the call." They sat. She had a summary of the 3 service reviews in front of her, printed, annotated. She was prepared. So was he. They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. She was direct and specific, and she pushed back twice when she disagreed with his assessment. And both times she listened when he explained his reasoning, and once she changed her position, and once she held it and told him why, and he respected both. She asked about his licensing, his insurance, his emergency response time, his equipment. She did not ask about his family or his background or where he'd gone to school, which he appreciated. At the end, she said, "I'll have Gerald send over the draft terms. Take the week. If there are things that don't work for you, come back with specifics." "I will," he said. He stood, gathered his notes, and was at the door when she said, behind him, "We took her to Hartwell last Saturday." He turned. Margos was looking out the window at the parking lot below, not at him. "Piper wanted to go on the climbing structure. The one that looks like a boat." A pause. She talked to her father the whole time she was on it, like he was standing at the bottom watching her. She looked at Declan then. "She does that sometimes. I didn't know she did it at the playground. I'd never taken her." Declan stood in the doorway. "Was it hard?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "and then I was glad we went." He recognized his own words. He didn't point that out. He just nodded. "See you in a week," he said. "See you in a week," she said. The terms were fair. He came back with 2 specifics. They adjusted one and held on the other. And he signed the contract on a Wednesday afternoon in November in Gerald's office, while Gerald printed the final version and Margot was in a call down the hall. He was walking through the lobby when he heard the elevator. Piper came out of it, holding a backpack that was slightly too big for her, wearing a coat with a corgi on the pocket, and she was talking to a woman who was clearly her grandmother. The same dark eyes, the same particular quality of stillness. They were apparently debating something. The grandmother was winning. Then Piper looked up and saw him. She stopped walking entirely. "You're the man from the hospital," she said. "I am," he said. "Declan." "I know." She tilted her head. "Do you work here now?" "Sort of. I'm going to help fix things in some of your mom's buildings." Piper considered this with the gravity she seemed to apply to all information. "That's good," she said finally. "Things should work properly." "That's my feeling too," he said. Her grandmother was looking at him with the particular attention of someone who has heard a story and is now matching it to a face. "You're the one from the hospital," she said. "Not a question." "Yes, ma'am." "She talked about you," the grandmother said. "Quite a bit, for a 6-year-old. Declan looked at Piper. Piper looked back at him with complete composure. "I said you came back," she said matter-of-factly, "that some people say they will and then they don't. But you did." He didn't have anything to say to that was equal to it. So he just said, "See you around, Piper." "See you around, Declan," she said. And then her grandmother steered her gently toward the reception desk, and she went, already explaining something new, her hands moving. He pushed through the glass doors into the cold November air of the parking lot. The sky was the pale, flat white of a day that would probably see the first real snow before week's end. He stood for a moment beside his truck, key in hand, not quite ready to get in. Some things you don't know how to hold until you've been holding them for a while. He thought about Ruthie, who smelled his jacket and said, "I like it." He thought about Piper, who had 6 years ago decided that the smell of a stranger was the close thing she had to something she missed more than she had words for, and had simply reached for it. Not because the world had taught her to, because no one had yet taught her not to. He got into his truck, he started the engine. The heat came on after a moment, and the cab filled with the particular warmth of a machine working exactly the way it should. He drove home to Stittsville.